প্রথম 2 রমজানের জন্য ভিন্ন ভিন্ন টপিকে রিয়াকশন করছি এবং আমার চেষ্টা আছে মোস্টলি ইসলামিক হিস্টোরি রিলেটেড সব কিছুতে আসলে ডিসকাশন করার। তো বরাবরের মতোই প্রথম ভিডিও আমার ইউটিউব চ্যানেলে কন্টেন্টের, সেকেন্ড ভিডিওতে কিছু ওই ধরনের কথাবার্তা আছে এবং তুমি সবাই এখন আসলে জানো যে ইউটিউব কী পরিমাণে সেন্সরিং করা শুরু করছে, ফেসবুক তো আরও বেশি করে কম্পেয়ার টু ইউটিউব তাও কিছুটা তোমার ছাড় দেয়। সো সেন্সরের জন্য আমাদের ভিডিও সেকেন্ড পার্টটা আসছে হলো মাহফিলে, বাংলাদেশের যে সোশ্যাল মিডিয়া প্ল্যাটফর্মটা আছে, এবং টেলিগ্রামে কোনো ইস্যু নেই। সো টেলিগ্রামে চাইলে গিয়ে দেখতে পারো। সো আজকে আমরা শুরু করে আসবো ডক্টর ইয়াকুব আহমেদেরই ভিডিওতে আমরা রিয়াকশন করবো এবং লম্বা সময়তে তার ভিডিওতে আসলে রিয়াকশন দেওয়ার চেষ্টা করবো, কারণ আমার মনে হয় না যে অ্যাটলিস্ট আমার দেখা আশেপাশে এত ডেপথে ইংলিশ ভাষায় এত সুন্দরভাবে আসলে অটোমানদের হিস্টোরি কেউ ডিসকাশন করছে। সো শুরু করি আজকে।
Is anything. The speed in which all sorts of things are moving tells you that anything is possible. That's what history tells us, right? The Roman Empire is not here anymore. The British Empire is not here anymore. The Ottoman Empire is not here anymore. That rationality tells you that. The Quran tells you that, because only Allah Ta'ala is forever. And so any Muslim who doesn't think in this way, forget Muslim, even anyone who doesn't, what happened. Now, the hope is, okay, we were unable to stop what happened. Now, the hope is, okay, we were unable to stop that extreme moment. But the hope is, okay, we have to take a moral responsibility. Is that where do we go now from here? That if we permit that the genocide happened and that's it, and let's just go back to our lives, that's a very sad place to be. That is a very inhumane place to be. And it's not normal for human beings. In fact, it's schizophrenic. So fundamentally, we can't forget that. We have to say,
সো সেকেন্ড ভিডিওতে কিছু ওই ধরনের কথাবার্তা আছে, এবং তুমি সবাই এখন আসলে জানো যে ইউটিউব কি পরিমাণে সেন্সরিং করা শুরু করছে। ফেসবুক তো আরো বেশি করে কম্পেয়ার টু ইউটিউব তাও কিছুটা তোমার ছাড় দেয়। সো সেন্সরের জন্য আমাদের ভিডিও সেকেন্ড পার্টটা আসছে হলো মাহফিলে, বাংলাদেশের যে সোশ্যাল মিডিয়া প্ল্যাটফর্মটা আছে, এবং টেলিগ্রামে কোনো ইস্যু নেই। সো টেলিগ্রামে চাইলে গিয়ে দেখতে পারো। সো আজকে আমরা শুরু করে আজকে ডক্টর ইয়াকুব আহমেদেরই ভিডিওতে আমরা রিয়াকশন করবো, এবং লম্বা সময়তে তার ভিডিওতে আসলে রিয়াকশন দেওয়ার চেষ্টা করব, কারণ আমার মনে হয় না যে অ্যাটলিস্ট আমার দেখা আশেপাশে এত ডেপথে ইংলিশ সুন্দরভাবে
Anyone who doesn't think in this way has become trapped into the box of the contemporary mind, which is to not allow you to imagine a future apart from the ones that have been told to you. And I don't think that's healthy.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I see that you're enjoying the content. How can you not take subscribe?
Gaza has just been a particularly unique manifestation in which it's been filmed real time by the victim on social media in the hope that humanity will come forward and save them. And we didn't. We didn't. We were just watching those videos on the internet, and that's what happened. Now, the hope is, okay, we were unable to stop that extreme moment, but the hope is, okay, we have to take a moral responsibility. Is that where do we go now from here? That if we permit that the genocide happened and that's it, and let's just go back to our lives, that's a very sad place to be. That is a very inhumane place to be. And it's not normal for human beings. In fact, it's schizophrenic. So fundamentally, we can't forget that. We have to say we want something different from that. And that demand has to be made for the whole of humanity. Because the way we're living right now, we're going down a direction which is going to destroy us all.
It's a factual statement to say that the last time there's peace, security, stability in the Holy Land is shown as under Islamic governance.
Yeah, absolutely.
We saw what Crusader rule looked like from 1099 to 1182. We're seeing what Zionist Jewish control looks like. Tell us a bit about what the Holy Land looked like and what it meant for the Hamid in that period.
Look, and this is not a romanticization, by the way. When you look at the Ottoman Empire, you can have confessional tensions that existed in the Ottoman world. No one's denying that. But continuously in the late Ottoman period, the majority of the tensions that exist within the Ottoman period were outside intervention. Well, colonial intervention to somehow carve up that region so that they can use the resources in the way they see fit, and they can see the people as resources in the way they see fit. The Ottoman world was still held together in an alternative framework in which fundamentally religion was important, and there is a moral compass that religion has. People will talk about the religious wars and so forth in that sense, but absolve themselves in terms of what's happening right now, as if secular wars have not been equally violent, right? But this is a red herring of an argument. And in the Ottoman world, the way that they look at it is they had spheres of influence, and then there had to be harmony between node points. So I'll explain that a lot. In the Ottoman Empire, Jevdet Pasha, who's an island of the Ottoman world, says that the Ottomans have been blessed with bringing together the 5 spheres or 5 ecosystems, you can call it that. So Bilad al-Rum, right? The Balkans and Anatolia. And then Mesopotamia. Bilad al-Sham, including Beit al-Maqdis. Misr, so wherever was the sphere of influence for Egypt, whether that be Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan, and so forth. And then the Hijaz. And these are ecosystems, organic ecosystems that actually didn't need any executive intervention on it. These function in of themselves, and the peoples of these regions engage and interact with each other. The job of the Ottoman government was to make sure that by and large there was harmony amongst these ecosystems. And there was node points where these ecosystems would overlap each other. So Bilad al-Rum over like Bilad al-Sham and Bilad al-Sham and the Hijaz and so forth. So long as those levels of harmony within these spaces, that the natural order will be kept. It's when there was an agitation in these places that you start to see problem areas. And today, to some degree, you can see like areas like Bilad al-Sham and so forth, that there is some sort of agitation in the region of the Bilad al-Sham, but in many ways. And that is something that we should imagine perhaps in terms of how Allah Ta'ala speaks about the idea of Bilad al-Sham in the Quran, right? And then how Muslims in the past have dealt with maintaining the ecosystem of Bilad al-Sham. I think that's an important imagination for people to have. And the Ottomans did a decent job of that, within the remit that they did it. Because since then, the world is how we have it right now.
I don't mean to go on a side questions conversation, but since we're doing it, it is relevant. Tell us a bit about just the Jews under the Ottoman rule, and particularly a group called the Donne. I don't want to go to a conspiracy theory rabbit hole, but just in light of the Epstein leaks and
ওকে, এই পয়েন্টটা শুরু করার আগে কিছু কথা আসলে বইলানি। আমাদের সেকুলার যে একটা ইতিহাসের ধারা বা ইতিহাসের একটা কাহিনী আসলে বিল্ড আপ করা হয়েছে আমাদের এডুকেশনের মাধ্যমে হোক, আমেরিকার মুভির মাধ্যমে হোক, বা ওভারঅল সায়েন্টিফিক যে কোনো মেথড আমাদের আশেপাশে আমরা আসলে দেখতে পাই, এই সবকিছু কিন্তু একটা সুনির্দিষ্ট বইতে, একটা স্ট্রাকচারাল বইতে কিন্তু আসলে প্রেজেন্টেশন করা হয়েছে আমাদের সামনে। মানে এমন না যে সবকিছু জাস্ট হইতেছে, যদিও তারা ওইভাবে আসলে প্রেজেন্টেশন করার চেষ্টাও করে যে এটাই হইলো নর্মাল, এটাই সবসময় ছিল, এইভাবে আসলে সবসময় দেখতে হবে। বাট তুমি দেখবা সেকুলারদের ভিতরে একটা টেন্ডেন্সি আছে যে তারা আসলে বলার চেষ্টা করে যে এম্পায়ার খারাপ, ওকে, বাট সকল এম্পায়ার না। রোমান এম্পায়ার ছিল যেখানে তারা আবার খুবই ভালো ভালো দিক আসলে বের করে, বাট ইন জেনারেল এম্পায়ার খারাপ। সো আমাদের যে ডেমোক্রেসি আছে, সেকুলারিজম আছে, ধর্ম থেকে দূরে, এবং এম্পায়ারের সাথে তারা আবার ধর্মকে অ্যাড করে। যে দেখো প্রত্যেকটা এম্পায়ারের সাথে একটা ধর্মযুক্ত ছিল। মুসলিমদের যতগুলো তুমি বড় বড় খিলাফত দেও তাদের সাথে ইসলাম যুক্ত ছিল, ঠিক আছে। তো মুসলিমদের সাথে কোন এম্পায়ার আসলে অটোমেটিক্যালি ইসলামকে আবার যুক্ত করতো। খ্রিস্টান এম্পায়ারের বিরুদ্ধে তারা যুদ্ধ করে আসলে সেকুলারিজমকে বিল্ড আপ করছে ইউরোপে। সো খ্রিস্টানদেরকেও তারা, স্পেশালি ক্যাথলিকদের, প্রোটেস্ট্যান্ট তো এমনি তো আসলে কোনো কিছু বিল্ড আপ করার আগেই তারা সকল কিছু আসলে স্যাক্রিফাইস করছে। প্রোটেস্ট্যান্ট খ্রিস্টানদের অবস্থা আরো ভয়াবহ। অর্থোডক্স, ইস্টার্ন অর্থোডক্স যেটা রাশিয়ান আসলে ফলো করে, ওইখানে আসলে কিছুটা তুমি ওই প্রিজার্ভ করার একটা মেন্টালিটি আছে যে তারা কিছু না কিছু আসলে বাঁচানোর চেষ্টা করছে এবং বাঁচাইতেও পারছে। বাট সেকুলারিজম যে পরিমাণে ব্লাড থার্স্টি ছিল থ্রু আউট হিস্টোরিতে লাস্ট 300 বছর, তুমি ফ্রান্সের রেভলিউশনের কথাই পড়ো, আমেরিকান রেভলিউশন এবং ইন্টার আমেরিকার 200 বছর ইতিহাস, এবং আমেরিকা অ্যাজ এ এম্পায়ার হিসেবে যেই পরিমাণে ব্লাড নিচ্ছে, দুনিয়াতে যে পরিমাণ মানুষ হত্যা করছে, আমার মনে হয় না লাস্ট 3000 বছরে এই পরিমাণে মানুষের খুন করা কারো পক্ষে সম্ভব ছিল। ইন্টেন্ট কিছু ওটা ম্যাটার করে না, বাট সেকুলারিজম যেই পরিমাণে ব্লাড নিচ্ছে এবং ডেমোক্রেসি প্রতিষ্ঠা করার জন্য বা ওভারঅল আমেরিকানিজম প্রতিষ্ঠা করার জন্য, ওই আইডিয়াগুলো প্রতিষ্ঠা করার জন্য দুনিয়ার কোনো এম্পায়ার, কোনো তথ্য এর ধারে কাছেও কিন্তু আসলে ছিল না। সো ওই জিনিসটা কিন্তু আমাদের আসলে মাথায় রাখতে হবে যে যখন সেকুলারিজম বা সেকুলাররা বলে যে এম্পায়ার খারাপ, মুসলিমরা খারাপ, এম্পায়ারের কোনো কিছু বললেই প্রথমে আসলে পাশে অনেকগুলো ডিসক্লেইমার দিয়ে নেয় যে এগুলো আসলে মাথায় রাখতে হবে। বাট সেকুলারিজম যখনই ওরা প্রেজেন্ট করে একটা সুন্দর ডিস্টোপিয়ান কাহিনী বিল্ড আপ করে, ডিস্টোপিয়ান ন্যারেশন বইতে আসলে বর্ণনা দেয়, একটা শহর গ্লাস চমকাইতে আছে যেখানে মেয়েরা স্কার্ট পরে আছে, মানে একটা উইয়ার্ড ফ্যাসিনেশন তারা আসলে বিল্ড আপ করে মানুষের ভিতরে ডিজায়ারের। বাট অন্যদিকে তুমি দেখো ওই জিনিসটা প্রতিষ্ঠা করার জন্য তারা যেই পরিমাণে রক্তপাত করে, যে ইনসেন। আমেরিকা যেই পরিমাণে মানুষ হত্যা করছে তার 200-300 বছরের ইতিহাসে, রোমানরা অলমোস্ট 2000 বছরে, এবং তুমি অটোমানদেরকে কম্বাইন করো তাদের 600 বছর ইতিহাসে মিলে এত পরিমাণে রক্তপাত করার মতন ক্যাপাসিটি তাদের হয় নাই। সো এই জিনিসটা আসলে মাথায় রাখা উচিত। আচ্ছা, কন্টিনিউ করি।
And all this type of stuff and very dark activities pertaining to that individual as fraternity of satanic pedophiles and the most powerful people. What was life like for Jews under Ottoman rule, particularly again that period? I'm not talking about the breadth of the 4,600 years. I'm talking about that particular last 50 years. And who are the Dunmi?
So these are two separate questions.
Yeah.
So
Ask about.
Muhammad was able to do, make Muslims at least maintain in their memory the idea that a ethical, moral, political entity needs to exist. So this is why you see the emergence of the Khilafat Committee in India at the time, right? And even the formation of the idea of Pakistan at the time comes from this idea because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The trajectory of pan-Islamism to Islamism is where I have the problem here, because both are used in a derogatory manner.
Absolutely. There's no two ways about it.
It's pan-Islamism because there was a political entity like Abdul Hamid, and once the entity is gone and there's a movement to try to revive something, it's called Islamism. But they both mean the same thing, which is the instrumentalization of religion. Right here, this is why I have a problem with that type of terminology, perhaps. Well, what does that mean to belong to the Muslim world? Fundamentally, it means that Islam, in its political form, was the dominant hegemony that people were judging themselves by, both Muslims and non-Muslims. So India would be seen as part of the Muslim world. Spain at one point was part of the Muslim world. Today you'd have to say it isn't, because all of that, what I've just mentioned, has been extracted out.
Sure.
And so we Muslims living in the West perhaps are considered as part of the Ummah, but Britain would not be considered part of the Muslim world.
Quick word before we continue. There's a charity I want you to know about, helping households under great stress, Hugs. They support Muslim families right here at home in the UK, especially those whose lives have been uprooted by Islamophobia and national security measures. More on them in a bit, so stay tuned.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and the foes out there, and welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Didi Hussein. Before I introduce today's guest, I'm going to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode on all 4 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Do remember to click subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Today's guest is a very esteemed academic and historian, a dear brother, a teacher of mine, someone who has taught me many things without necessarily physically being blessed to be in his presence. He's an author, a lecturer, an Ottoman historian, and that's none other than my dear brother, Dr. Yaqub Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, bro.
So,
The idea of using the term pan-Islamism is to make the case that there's an instrumentalization of Islam via the political medium, right? Now, that's just not the case in regards to Islam. The complexity in Islam would be one, that Islam has always, from its inception, been political. But politics and Islam, to some degree, will have an element when you execute power, that there's going to be some use of rhetoric, symbolism, and language of Islam. Now, if that's going to be qualified as being the instrumentalization of Islam, that sort of what it suggests is that the Ummah, by and large, are absent in this conversation and have zero agency. The fact that power uses the rhetoric in the Ummah just follow as sheep. That's not necessarily the case. Historically, we seem to assume, and incorrectly assume, that because we have higher levels of literacy today, that we are more intelligent than the people of the past. And that is a sort of like modern construct we've internalized today. But people of the past were involved in political matters. They had different mechanisms, perhaps, of executing political matters. And they were exceptionally intelligent. What I would say is they may not be as literate today as we are now, but they were definitely well informed, probably on many occasions better informed than we are today, in regards to the political ingoings and ongoings of what's happening in the center. So the reason why I bring that caveat is because that term was used by the British as a way of, to some degree, trying to regulate the Ottoman sort of like policies regarding the Khilafah, the Caliphate, and so on. And that term stuck. And on many Ottoman historians and academics use that term, carte blanche. The policies or the terminology that the Ottomans used was Ittihad Islam. So it's sort of like the idea of Islamic unity. Right, and that has a different sort of a conceptual meaning to it. And people say it translates the same, but it doesn't.
would Islamiyun be inaccurate?
No, that wouldn't be inaccurate. That would be something that we could work with. Or in the Turkish, they will say Islam dunya, so the Muslim world, or so the Islamic world, or so forth. Now, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but these things are important.
No,
so
it's irrelevant.
people will say things like the Muslim world is a modern construction and so forth. No, Muslims have been visualizing the idea of belonging to a Muslim world for centuries. The idea is, then someone will say, well, what does that mean to belong to the Muslim world? Fundamentally, it means that Islam, in its political form, in its execution of certain legal practices and infused in culture, was the dominant hegemony that people were judging themselves by, both Muslims and non-Muslims. So India would be seen as part of the Muslim world. Spain at one point was part of the Muslim world. Today you'd have to say it isn't, because all of that, what I've just mentioned, has been extracted out.
Sure.
So the Ummah do go beyond the Muslim world, and so we Muslims living in the West perhaps are considered as part of the Ummah, but Britain would not be considered part of the Muslim world. So that's not some sort of, just linguistic gymnastics. Those things need to be qualified, just because that's how Muslims self-identified. Now, the reason why this becomes important about pan-Islamism as well is the distinction made between the idea of pan-Islamism and the idea of Ummah. That somehow the Ummah is a religious community. It's not a political community. And in fact, that's also not true historically. We see that the Ummah identified their religiosity with their politics. And the Ummah didn't see themselves as a set of identities in the way that we see it today. Yeah. In fact, even now in Britain, people will ask me, how do you write about minorities in Britain? And I would say, I do write about minorities, by the way. It was just the Ottomans. What Muslims can't conceptualize or visualize, perhaps, is the idea of having power. That's an anomaly in their mind. And the way that they see power at times is in Muslim majority countries, in which they would subscribe to the idea that that's still not Islamic power. And then there's been a lot of attack on the way that Islam would represent power. But anyone who's got any worth of salt would know that when we talk about power in Islam, it has to be held to a particular ethical and moral standard.
Sure.
So that caveat is important, because Abdul Hamid then, as a caliph, and it was also a contention point even in the Ottoman Empire, which is what was his remit in regards to his interaction with the Ummah. Now, there is an academic by the name of Jan Peter Hartung. He makes this argument about Muslim communities are emotional communities, making the case that not emotional in terms of they are erratic, but emotional in the sense that religion as a sort of language and vocabulary speaks to both power and those who are being ruled. And power uses a set of language, symbols and rhetoric, and the ruled under them require those symbols, language and rhetoric. They both understand the relationship. In fact, they require those hierarchies as a way of making society function.
What do you think of that?
I think it's an interesting way of conceptualizing it, if from an academic perspective.
Do you think there's truth in it?
Yeah, I think so to some degree. I'm willing to go with it. And so if we're going to use the argument of an Islamic state, quote unquote, in today's vocabulary, perhaps, then it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that an Islamic state is an emotional state in the sense that fundamentally there is an ethical and moral core within the political structure that has to be held to account by a higher power. Accountability then is not simply one that's executed in this life. There's an accountability of the next life. That is infused in all the members that make up the Ummah, which means the average layman to the one who's wielding authority. That's throughout Islamic discourse of political thought. So once again, going back to Abdul Hamid then, and this sort of painting that I'm painting for you a little bit, it's important because when we say pan-Islamism, what we're actually doing is we're constructing a language of outside looking in, right? But I'm Muslim. So what I'm saying is, how do they self-identify internally? So acts of dawah, for example, are not, if we were to conceptualize that as Muslim missionary activity, it doesn't quite capture what dawah is in terms of an invitation to Islam.
No.
And so on. So here, I think and we spoke about this the last time when we were talking about the Ottomans and empire, and so on, and how language matters, right? And how we exercise language, how we use it. So for me, what I'm trying to do, perhaps as a historian, is by giving the Ottomans their agency back, is to give them the right to use, or I should use the vocabulary they were using to identify themselves or to express their policies. Now, those policies, in regards to Abdul Hamid,
was Abdul Hamid okay, as an ustad on this particular subject, let me allow me to reframe it then. Would it be then correct to then say, was Khalifa Abdul Hamid unique or distinct to his predecessors in the way he approached and envisaged his state and polity?
In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. So there's two aspects of this. In many ways, he was a continuation of the people that came before, people like Abdul Majid and Sultan Abdul Aziz and so forth. They all had this philosophy, especially after 1839, we call the post-Tanzimat policies, of reforming the Ottoman Empire, but also making Islam, or the language of Islam, far more, pronounced. Because there was a concern that Muslims at that moment were feeling the absolute force of Western colonialism. And listen, during this moment, this is not just a phenomenon from the Ottomans. You'll see the emergence of many movements, from the Wahhabi movement to the reformist Salafist movement to the Ahl al-Hadith movement,
Abdul Afghani,
to the Deobandis, to the Naqshbandis and so forth. These general movements around the Muslim world in trying to respond to this colonial intervention, right? And so in that sense, the Ottoman state also recognizes this. What Abdul Hamid is different from his predecessors is he's successfully been able to then curate policies that were far more efficient and effective in dealing with allowing Muslims to sort of like survive and have a vocabulary and a grammar that can deal with that colonial intervention, both locally within the Ottoman domains and then projecting it outside the Ottoman domains. That was unique. The idea that Abdul Hamid II was able to speak to Muslims around the world. And I was speaking to a brother only today when I was coming in the car from Manchester. And I said, one of the things that people sometimes forget about Sultan Abdul Hamid II is that even though maybe he wasn't able to save the empire, but he managed to safeguard the legacy of the empire. Right? And I'm using this word empire loosely here before people lose their minds a little bit. There is an article for anyone who's interested by Sanjay Subramaniam who says that not all empires are the same. Right? There is this academic discourse, and that the Ottoman Empire, if we're going to use this term lightly in English, loosely in the English medium, is a different empire than the Western empires.
But the usage of the word itself doesn't necessarily mean they're all the same.
It doesn't mean they're all the same, exactly. And I'm going off tangent once again, and people in the
tangents are good.
Yeah, people in the comments can go bananas on me if they want, and it's not a problem, and I'll deal with that later. But I'm just saying I might be slipping in and out of this, and
sure,
don't hold me on that. But what Abdul Hamid was able to do was make Muslims at least maintain in their memory the idea that a ethical, moral, political entity needs to exist. So this is why you see the emergence of the Khilafat Committee in India at the time, right? And even the formation of the idea of Pakistan at the time comes from this idea because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There was a particular feeling of loss and then recognition that it's not going to return.
Was the marriage of the son of the Nizam of Hyderabad to the daughter of the Ottoman Caliph an attempt to preserve that?
Yeah, it was, and I think it's Imran Mullah who's written a book on this. Yeah, and it's a very good read, and I'm really proud of him in terms of what he's put forward in positive. And he actually took the initiative himself at such a young age to actually go out and investigate this. It's a very good form of investigative historical work.
So was that marriage a manifestation of the things that you're describing?
The marriage was in this what we call interwar period, an attempt to try to safeguard something that had collapsed in front of them, and you can see the remnants of that. But that's not the only remnants. I mean, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, you see many of the ulama and thinkers around the world, and you see this in the works of Maulana Hassan, who makes the case that there was a real yearning and longing for something that had gone, because the immediate consequences of the collapse of empire was catastrophic for the Ummah. In fact, the lowest point is not 1924 for the Ummah. In fact, when you read the historical accounts, it continues until 1950 with the creation of the State of Israel. In fact, much of our imagination today regarding how we see ourselves in the world is a post-1950s world. The 19th century is still very different from the 20th century. And so what happens in the 1950s? You have the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You have the fall of the Meiji dynasty and so on. You have partition in India taking place and the British losing India. The British as an alien empire is now gone. So colonialism in the form that we know it is sort of like disappearing. We have the creation of the State of Israel. We have the creation of the United Nations, NATO, and the sort of global infrastructure we have, and we have the rise of the United States of America as a superpower, fundamentally that's the world that we've been living in and couched in for the last decades, right?
70, 80 years.
What's interesting right now, perhaps, and this is another tangent, is it seems like the Israelis and the Americans have decided that they want to reset that world order that they created because it's not working for them anymore. But the point I'm trying to make is a lot of how we imagine the 19th century is collapsed in from ideas that came from the 20th century, like the idea of the modernization theory and so forth. And many Muslim Orientalists who emerged from the Muslim world, or even Muslim thinkers who to some degree had this particular complex because their imaginations were restricted to that, have often written from that perspective. But the 19th century, going back to even the attempt to revive the Ottoman Caliphate, there's a lot of interesting things that happened there pre-World War II. And these moments are important. That there's a world before World War One, there's an interworld period between World War One and World War Two, and then there's a new world that's created post-World War Two, which is the world that we've been living in for so long. And that's the imagination that we have regarding the 19th century that needs to change. Now, going back to Abdul Hamid, because I went off on this tangent.
No, this sounds important.
Is that Abdul Hamid became a victim in the historiography of the post-1950s world, which wanted to show that the Ottoman past was a decadent past to some degree. Now, many contemporary Ottoman historians, who are non-Muslim, by the way, would question that. And what Abdul Hamid was able to do, I guess, is recognize that to safeguard the Ottoman world and the Ottoman domains, it was important that he provided at least some vocabulary for the Muslims around the world to sort of like escape from the colonial rope that was around their neck.
Was he successful in that?
Well, there's nothing he could do about what was happening to Muslims around the world. So people keep asking me, did the Ottomans fail the Muslim world?
But they adopt his framing, what he was trying to normalize at a time where the Ummah needed its own framing, its own discourse. Was he successful in those outside of the domains in adopting that framing?
I think
being influenced by it.
I think the influence is there for sure. I remember growing up as a kid, hearing Jummah khutbas in my local Deoband masjid, still praising Sultan Abdul Hamid II, because those khutbas were being given in India at the time. So this is not new in that sense. What's unique, I guess, power is capable of writing about itself, right? And people often, the adage is that the ones who win the war, Churchill, they can write regarding how they have power. Now, the British Empire still exists, or the Empire's gone. Britain still exists, and it's residually declining rapidly, but it's managed to still project and manifest an understanding that it was an empire, and it still belongs to a Western hegemonic bloc. It needs that, but the Ottomans don't exist, so they can't write that history. And so that agency is lost to who? To the academies around the world. But alhamdulillah.
So history is written by the victors.
To some degree. But what's very unique here is there's people like myself and others who somehow have found a way of, like a small plant coming through the concrete wall. And in that sense, the Ummah have found ways of talking about Ottoman history in this sense. What's been disappointing for me, perhaps, is every time I've spoke about Ottoman history, not as somebody who has a religious devotion to the Ottomans and this immense, devotional bias to them. I'm a historian. I want to make that very clear to whoever's watching this right now, which is my job is to be as truthful and as I can be about writing about the Ottoman Empire. And I do that with all Islamic history when I work on. In fact, I do that on all histories that I work on. I've been writing recently about the Meiji dynasty, right? The assumption is that because I write about the Ottomans, that somehow it's okay to just attack me and call me a sellout and all these sort of things. And, this is not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do here, perhaps, is I want Muslims to remove that 600-year blind spot that they have, because I think that's detrimental.